Asiana Airlines Flight 214, a Boeing 777-200ER, departed from Incheon International Airport in Seoul, South Korea, bound for San Francisco International Airport on July 6, 2013. The long-haul trans-Pacific flight was expected to be smooth, operated by one of the world's most technologically advanced aircraft. On board were 291 passengers and 16 crew members, all expecting a routine landing in California. Inside the cockpit, Captain Lee Kang-kook, an experienced pilot but relatively new to flying the Boeing 777, was in command under the supervision of Captain Lee Jong-min, an instructor pilot. They were joined by First Officer Bong Dong-won, forming a standard three-pilot crew. For the majority of the flight, the journey was uneventful. The aircraft cruised at 35,000 feet, covering thousands of miles over the Pacific Ocean. Passengers relaxed, enjoyed in-flight meals, and watched movies, unaware that their landing would become one of the most shocking aviation incidents in modern history. As Flight 214 neared the California coast, the pilots prepared for their approach into San Francisco International Airport, SFO. The airport, known for its runway configurations and visual landings, had glide slope guidance turned off that day due to maintenance, a critical factor that would soon play a deadly role. As Flight 214 descended toward San Francisco, the pilots were cleared for a visual approach to runway 28L, one of the airport's main landing strips. With clear skies and light winds, conditions seemed ideal. However, something was off from the start. Since the instrument landing system ILS glide slope was out of service, the pilots had to manually control their descent. Captain Lee Kang-kook, still inexperienced with visual landings in the Boeing 777, relied on the autothrottle system to maintain the correct approach speed. But he didn't realize something crucial. The autothrottle was not actively controlling airspeed. As the aircraft neared 1,500 feet, it was already too high on the glide path. Captain Lee, realizing this, reduced power to correct the altitude. However, he failed to closely monitor the airspeed. As a result, the aircraft began descending too rapidly. At 500 feet, the pilots should have been at a stable approach speed of 137 knots. Instead, Flight 214 was slowing down dangerously, without the crew noticing. The aircraft was now approaching the critical threshold of a stall. At 200 feet, the aircraft's airspeed had dropped to 112 knots, far below the safe approach speed. The stick shaker, a loud warning system that alerts pilots of an impending stall, activated, but the pilots were already too low to make a full recovery. "Speed! Speed!" First Officer Bong Dong-won shouted, realizing they were too slow. Captain Lee instinctively pushed the throttle forward, but by now it was too late. The aircraft was only 100 feet above the water, with the runway threshold fast approaching. The ground proximity warning system, GPWS, activated. Sink rate, sink rate. Desperate to avoid a stall, Captain Lee pulled back on the control yoke, but the aircraft's tail was already too low. At 11:28 a.m., the tail of the Boeing 777 struck the seawall at the edge of the runway, ripping off the aft fuselage and landing gear instantly. The aircraft violently skidded along the runway, sparks and debris flying everywhere. The main cabin broke apart, exposing the interior to the outside world. Flames erupted from one of the engines as the aircraft spun and came to a halt in a cloud of smoke and dust. Inside the cabin, the impact was catastrophic. Overhead bins burst open, sending luggage flying. Passengers were thrown violently against their seatbelts, some suffering serious spinal injuries from the sudden force of deceleration. Screams filled the cabin as flight attendants, despite their own injuries, rushed to evacuate survivors. The aircraft's emergency slides deployed, but chaos unfolded as one slide inflated inside the cabin, pinning a flight attendant against the wall. Outside, the wreckage of Flight 214 was scattered across the runway, with thick black smoke rising from the burning engine. Firefighters and emergency crews raced to the scene, unsure of how many had survived. Miraculously, most of the passengers survived the impact, but 3 lives were lost, including 2 teenage girls from China who were thrown from the aircraft. One of them was tragically run over by a rescue vehicle in the confusion. The crash was one of the most survivable major aviation accidents in history, but it left behind critical lessons for the aviation industry. The National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, immediately launched an investigation, focusing on what went wrong during the approach. The findings were shocking. The pilots did not properly monitor their airspeed, leading to a dangerously low approach. The autothrottle was assumed to be maintaining speed, but it was actually inactive due to manual inputs. The captain was not fully comfortable with visual landings in the Boeing 777 and had misjudged the approach glide path. The first officer hesitated to challenge the captain's decisions, leading to a delayed reaction. The biggest mistake? The pilots forgot to cross-check their airspeed manually, relying too much on automation. They assumed the aircraft was doing the work for them. The crash exposed serious training gaps in handling manual landings, especially when pilots were accustomed to heavy reliance on automation. As a result, the aviation industry overhauled pilot training programs, emphasizing better situational awareness during manual landings, proactive communication among cockpit crew to prevent hesitation in emergencies. More hands-on training for pilots in handling low-speed approaches. Despite the horror of the crash, Asiana Flight 214 became a landmark case in the importance of human vigilance in an era of increasing automation. The pilots forgot something big, and it nearly cost 307 lives. In the days following the crash, survivors of Asiana Flight 214 began sharing their harrowing accounts of the final moments before impact and the chaotic evacuation that followed. Some described the sudden jolt of impact, while others recalled how seats tore loose from the floor, throwing passengers across the cabin. Many of the injured suffered spinal fractures due to the extreme forces involved in the crash. Flight attendants played a critical role in the evacuation, guiding terrified passengers toward the emergency exits, despite the rising smoke and fear of explosion. One survivor, a teenage girl from China, described how she and her friend were separated during the evacuation. Tragically, her friend was later identified as one of the 3 fatalities, a victim of confusion and the rush to escape the wreckage. Meanwhile, emergency responders struggled to navigate through the wreckage. Some of the injuries worsened due to delayed treatment, as medical teams prioritized the most critical cases. As investigators dug deeper into the crash, one major concern stood out: over-reliance on automation. Pilots of modern aircraft, especially in long-haul operations, rely on autopilot and automated landing systems for much of the flight. Flight 214's pilots, accustomed to these automated systems, struggled with manual speed control when the Instrument Landing System, ILS, was unavailable. The failure to actively monitor airspeed led to the fatal low-speed approach. The NTSB emphasized the urgent need for better manual flight training, arguing that pilots should not become over-dependent on automation. Airlines around the world took notice, implementing new policies requiring pilots to practice manual landings regularly. The pilots of Flight 214 were left with immense guilt and emotional trauma. Captain Lee Kang-kook, who had been in training on the Boeing 777, faced intense scrutiny for his misjudgment during the approach. Despite surviving the crash, he struggled with the knowledge that his decisions had led to fatalities. He later testified that he had been overwhelmed by the complexity of manually landing the 777, a statement that fueled debates about whether airlines should change how pilots transition to larger aircraft. First Officer Bong Dong-wan, who had identified the speed issue too late, also suffered severe emotional distress, feeling that he had failed to act more assertively. For the cabin crew, their heroism in evacuating passengers earned them global recognition, but the trauma of the event lingered for years. Many required psychological counseling to cope with the memories of that tragic morning. The crash of Asiana Flight 214 sent shockwaves through the aviation industry. Regulators and airlines re-evaluated pilot training programs, with an increased focus on manual flying skills and go-around training, better cockpit communication protocols to ensure first officers speak up in critical situations, more rigorous simulations of low-speed landings to prevent similar errors. Boeing also responded by updating training manuals for the 777, highlighting how pilots should handle non-functional, glide slope landings. Asiana Airlines revised its training programs, ensuring that future pilots would be better prepared for visual approaches and not rely too heavily on automated systems. The FAA and NTSB worked closely with global airlines to ensure new safety measures were implemented worldwide. A decade later, the crash of Asiana Flight 214 remains one of the most studied aviation incidents in history. It exposed the hidden risks of over-reliance on automation, forcing airlines to rethink their approach to training and pilot decision-making. Survivors and families of the victims gather each year to honor those lost and to celebrate those who survived. A memorial plaque at San Francisco International Airport serves as a reminder of the lessons learned from the crash. The disaster led to major reforms in the aviation industry, ensuring that pilots are better equipped to handle manual landings, and emphasizing the importance of clear cockpit communication. Though the crash was tragic, the lessons from Flight 214 helped prevent future accidents, making flying safer for millions of passengers worldwide. One small mistake changed everything, but it also changed aviation forever.